Good morning. My name is Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro, and I am the team lead for the implementation of the recommendations of the Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness. You have some materials that have been provided to you of a timeline of the report preparation that was prepared by Alicia Adams of the St. Joseph Center. And so this video is really designed to tell you where we are to go forward from the recommendations of the Ad Hoc Committee. So one of the things we know about the progress that's been made to date on the recommendations is that some, in fact, have been completed. We have some victories, and others have been, started. But of course, we have 67 recommendations, and so we really have much further to go. And so what we're going to talk about today is what that looks like. Since the report came out in December of 2018 and was really launched in February of 2019, we've had this huge pandemic, we've had economic downturn, we've had movements for racial justice. What we do know is that immediately prior to the pandemic, African Americans or Black people in Los Angeles County were about 8.4% of the population, but they represented approximately 34% of the homeless population in Los Angeles County based on the count that was done last year. This year, we're not doing a count due to COVID-19, but we can anticipate based on some other data that we have that the statistics are getting much worse, both with regard to the impact of COVID-19, but also with regard to the economic downturn that has also happened in the light of COVID-19. So one of the things that we know is that unemployment rates for Black men, women, and youth have skyrocketed during the pandemic. And so while those numbers were already higher than other groups to begin with, they are certainly continuing to be high in this era of pandemic, which means that many more people are vulnerable to losing their housing, despite the eviction moratoria that are going on right now at the federal and the state levels. So we have been thinking for the past few months since we came on board in August of 2020 about how do we think about the new normal of COVID-19? And we have some questions that we're already considering. Some are very concrete, like what happens with regard to people after Project Roomkey? Yes, there's been a promise of housing, but we noticed in the implementation of Project Roomkey to begin with that there were racial disparities in terms of who was getting into Project Roomkey. Now, they did fix those once they found out about them. But of course, part of what we're trying to do in the implementation of the report is to be proactive so we don't have to wait for a racial disparity to show up in order to get Black people experiencing homelessness access to the services and to the housing in particular that they need. Second and third questions are really about what's going to happen when these moratoria actually expire. We know that Blacks already have a higher rate of eviction, both actual and then their vulnerability to it. And also we know that there is additional damage that is done because of these higher rates of eviction to Black renters once they are now trying to get housing post-eviction. And then last, but certainly not least, this is something based on some research that we've done in other areas. We know, for example, some of the government programs that were put in place to help Black-led and Black empowering organizations actually did not end up helping Black-led and Black empowering organizations. So if you think about something like the PPP loans that were accessible to nonprofits in Los Angeles County at the federal level, well, we found that Black-led and Black empowering organizations, those who really constitute the Black social safety net, right, were not getting access to those loans at the same rate as their non-Black counterparts. And this was true at the nonprofit and the corporate level. So this really creates a problem because the Black social safety net has always been there when government policies failed. So whether it was in slavery, when slaves became too old to work and to be economically productive, and they were turned out of the plantations and the farms that they had been brought to and enslaved, and were made homeless, literally in slavery, through the 1930s and the Great Depression, and actually cutting Black-led industries and sectors like domestic work and agricultural work out of the Social Security Act, to now with the PPP loan crisis, we see that this Black social safety net has provided resources when government policies fail to cover Black people. And now we're seeing in COVID that even that safety net is being frayed. Both faith-based organizations and advocacy organizations and empowering service agencies have all struggled in this area. So our main deliverable remains something that is important and critical for advancing the recommendations of the ad hoc committee. We absolutely want to deliver by August of 2023 a fully piloted initiative that is ready for a 3 to 5 year investment at scale. So one of the things that you saw from the slides that were prepared of the timeline is that the report was disseminated far and wide at the national level, the state level, and the local level. And now it will be time to implement and put our money where our mouth is to develop this initiative that can actually not just move the needle, with what we always say, but also really transform how we think about access to housing and housing as a right in many ways. So this fully piloted initiative will be ready based on the implementation work we're going to be doing over the next 18 to 24 months. In order to do that, we've actually composed 6 work groups, and each work group is composed of key partners. And so I want to walk through how intentional we're being about the composition of these work groups. Certainly the co-chairs of these work groups will include a member of the ad hoc committee itself. And again, it's really important to make sure that the ad hoc committee is included both in the leadership and the membership of these work groups, because not only was that work transformative when it was initially done as a report in 2018 and 2019, but it's always important to make sure that the folks who were experiencing the problem are at the center of the solutions. And that's why, in addition to having co-chairs who are part of the ad hoc committee lead the work, we are also going to have at least 18 people with lived experience who will be part of these 6 work groups. So that is at least 2 to 3 or 30% or so of every single committee, of every single work group will actually include people with lived experience. Also, we've secured funding so that they will be compensated for their work. We are not asking them to volunteer their services without compensation. And we're working to arrange ways in which they can be compensated so that it does not put them at risk of losing things like their housing and other benefits that they're already receiving. We also need, of course, county and city level partnership. And so we are partnering with Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza of ARDI and also with the offices of Mark Ridley Thomas and Marquise Harris Dawson at the city council level, as well as the mayor's racial equity director, Brenda Shockley, to make sure that, again, we have elected officials as well as implementation agency support for getting the work done. We also, of course, would not be where we are today in some of this without our activists and our advocates. And so again, we will make sure that they are also a part of the work groups going forward. And where applicable, we will have lots of staff participate as well. So if we walk through what the 6 work groups are going to be focused on, we're going to be dividing up the recommendations that remain into these different 6 work groups. The first work group really comes out of one of the overall findings that the coordinated entry system has a significant set of racial disparities within it. Even if Black people are getting access to certain kinds of services, their ability to sustainably get those services or to be treated fairly when they're getting those services is something that this group will work on. This will be co-chaired by Reba Stevens, member of the ad hoc committee, and we're collaborating with the folks at USC who are working on revising the triage tools that are used as part of the CES. But know that this work group is not just about the triage tools. It is about the entire CES and the way that it operates and functions and its impact on Black people. Our second group is really focused on LAFA itself as a joint powers authority. And this group will be co-chaired by Elisa Orduña. And we will be collaborating here with LAFA's new racial equity director, who just came on in the month of February 2021, to really look at those recommendations that apply specifically to LAFA, to make sure that LAFA is transforming itself as much as the rest of the system around it is transforming itself. And so there are some very specific recommendations that that new racial equity director will work with this committee to actually make sure we pilot and effectively implement. The third committee is the Permanent Housing and Retention Committee that will be co-chaired by Veronica Lewis. And this committee will be focused on permanent housing, including permanent supportive housing and rapid response, but not just the permanent supportive housing. That is an important piece of what we're doing, and we are collaborating on with a team at UCLA on how we think about Black tenant retention in permanent supportive housing. So Dr. Norita Milburn and her team are focused on the idea that yes, Black people get into permanent supportive housing in roughly equal numbers to other racial groups, but they do not stay. And there are a variety of reasons that they're coming up with to find that. And there are at least 4 or 5 pilot implementation projects that are coming out of that collaboration that we will test specifically. The fifth group is the prevention group that is going to be co-chaired by Dr. Felicia Adams. And this collaboration, we're still determining what that's going to look like, but we absolutely want to make sure that that collaboration is collaborating with agencies, both at the city and county level, to make sure that there are places where collaboration can actually move upstream in terms of some of the causes and challenges that Black people experiencing homelessness end up with downstream. The last and final group is the Complex Collaboration and Coordination Group. This will be co-chaired by Dr. Jack Barber. And here we're proposing that this group work with advanced efforts that are already ongoing. And so the example we have here is the idea of the alternatives to incarceration work and reentry work that's being done at the county level. There is a tremendous amount of work and energy that's being put into that. And rather than have the ad hoc committee's recommendations sit outside of that work and kind of work in a silo, we think it's a better idea to partner with efforts like the alternatives to incarceration work to make sure that attention to homelessness and attention to the experiences that Black people experiencing houselessness face be embedded in that work rather than operating in a silo outside of that work. And so these are the 6 work groups that we're currently populating and we will launch in March of 2021. So what is our implementation timeline? We are anticipating that there will be a comprehensive community engaged process of making sure that we actually pilot these recommendations effectively and that we assess these recommendations effectively. So one of the hallmarks of the process that the ad hoc committee did in the production of the report was to have a community engaged effort, and we plan to continue those goals. We will also be working from those principles of Black equity. We will be emphasizing the principles of strength, of truth, of love, and of strategic disruption. So this may mean that the work groups may have some uncomfortable questions to ask, both themselves and the other folks who are doing the work. And also it's going to allow us to engage and have the community be engaged in the entire process. So from March to September of this year, 2021, we'll be focused on prioritizing our recommendations so that we can make sure that we're doing recommendations in the proper order so that we move things forward. And then site selection. We are fortunate that we plan to have site selections in all 5 of the supervisorial districts across LA County. And so we want to have a community engaged prioritization process and also community input on how the sites are selected for investment in this implementation plan. The next phase, of course, will be the actual implementation. And so we, again, will continue to have funding for lived experience in this phase. We will have funded pilot implementation. So the sites that are selected will receive funding to actually implement some of the ideas that come out of these recommendations. And then we are going to be in this phase also setting community-based benchmarks. So that part of that ongoing community engaged assessment of how the pilots are going is going to involve discussions around what are the benchmarks, what are the guidelines that we should be using to actually assess each of these. So rather than, again, grabbing off of a shelf something that, you know, scholars or other folks think should be happening, we're going to ask Black people experiencing homelessness themselves, the community themselves, about what those benchmarks should actually be for how we assess these pilots. And then the last phase, of course, will be the assessment. And then we want to have the scaling phase where we actually talk about what worked and what didn't, but also how do we scale this up so that it is county-wide, so that no matter where Black people are experiencing homelessness, they're actually getting access to what they need and also what we've learned, right, in terms of the implementation process. And so we will develop, as I mentioned before, that 5-year initiative that will be ready for full financial support. And so again, we know that county level governments won't be able to do everything, but we do know that neither will philanthropy be able to do everything. It's really going to take all of us pulling together to make this happen at scale. And so that's why we're going through such an intentional process of implementation and rigorous community assessment to make sure that we actually have something that is worthy of that scale of investment, so that we can, again, genuinely transform the systems, genuinely transform the ways in which Black people experiencing homelessness are able to finally get the homes that they have a right to and the services that they have a right to. So I want to just conclude by sharing the beautiful racial equity team. If you are interested and want more information about any aspect of this process, please feel free to reach out to me at ahancock@usc.edu. As you can see, I am joined by a very talented team, Dr. Dejanay Dozier, Casey Patterson, Anne-Marie Jones, and Kendrick Roberson. And all 5 of us are 100% committed to making sure that the implementation process really honors those principles of Black equity, honors the way in which community has always been at the heart of the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, and also is about the work and the results and not the ego. So we thank you and look forward to hearing from you should you have any questions. Thank you.